I want to address the other big story of the week, and that's Conservative MP Michael Chong, who is pressing the government, for answers over Chinese interference.
The government did nothing about a person in Canada that was targeting me and my family. The government knew about this 2 years ago, and they did nothing.
To be clear, as the Prime Minister said, he and I found out on Monday.
The government needs to come clean about who knew what and when and what they did about it.
We asked what happened to that information. Was it ever briefed up out of CSIS? It was not.
I find it very hard to believe that CSIS would produce a document about a Canadian MP's family being threatened because of a vote on the floor of the House of Commons and that they wouldn't tell the Prime Minister or his top public safety minister. This is insane.
We're taking additional steps to instruct the intelligence and security agencies within my portfolio to ensure that there is both timely and accurate reporting to the government around any threats involving parliamentarians.
If ministers of the Crown were and their offices were completely unaware of this, this shows an appalling breakdown in leadership on part of the Prime Minister.
We are making that directive now. We are making it clear to CSIS that when it involves an MP, even if it's not hitting a threshold that they would previously think needs to be highlighted, we should still know about it.
Okay, so what is the CSIS protocol in these situations, and should the Prime Minister have been briefed? Richard Fadden is the former director of CSIS and former National Security Advisor to Justin Trudeau and Stephen Harper. Mr. Fadden, thanks for joining us yet again.
Good to be with you.
So a key debate going on in Parliament today is whether or not CSIS shared this report about Michael Chong and his family with the government. What is your understanding of why or whether CSIS would hold back something like this from going to the Prime Minister and his office?
Well, to begin with, just to be clear, I don't know what happened. And that's one of the problems with these issues, is that we don't know what happens inside the various institutions. I think if the reporting is correct, and I have no reason to disbelieve it, CSIS should have shared it. The way this material sounds to me, it was a formal intelligence assessment, and you'll know as well as I that CSIS doesn't produce intelligence for itself. It produces it for the departments and agencies of the government and for the government itself. So it is unclear to me why it would have produced this comprehensive look at this particular issue and not shared it outside of CSIS. Now, whether or not it went to the Prime Minister is another question, because department and agencies do not directly send things to the Prime Minister. There's a system. No head of CSIS sits down and says, "Dear Mr. T, I thought you should read this." So the question is, did they follow their usual practice and send it out to the usual suspects, public safety, the National Security Advisor, possibly the RCMP? Whether it got to the Prime Minister or not, I have no reason to disbelieve the Prime Minister, but whether an individual is an MP or not, it seems to me if there's a credible threat, that threat should be pursued, if not by CSIS directly, then by another agency.
So what do we make of the fact that it doesn't appear to have been pursued by anybody? At least there's no public statement to that fact. And David Vigneault did brief Michael Chong yesterday on this. And Michael Chong didn't know about it until Monday. Marco Mendicino says he didn't know about it until Monday. And same thing with the Prime Minister. So what does that tell us about how serious this threat should be viewed?
Well, I think that's if you use an old expression, a $54,000 question. The threshold that should be used for reporting on threats. The Prime Minister has indicated that he wants CSIS to report on any threats to MPs. I think that's a dangerous thing to ask for. I can understand why he's frustrated and has said this, but it seems to me the best thing to happen would be to have the Minister of Public Safety to issue a ministerial directive under the Act after he's consulted with CSIS and his department, setting the threshold. The reason I say this, give you an example. If you and I, after one of your broadcasts, go out and have a beer, and we start talking about a variety of parliamentarians that we all know, and one of us says, well, he just needs a real shaking up. That could be interpreted by some as a threat. Do you want to report that? So you need to establish a reasonable threshold. I would publish the threshold if I were in charge, but whether you publish it or not, give CSIS some guidance on what is to be reported and under what conditions.
So I just want to backtrack a little bit. If CSIS had followed its usual practice, as you were saying, on this intelligence assessment and sent it to the RCMP or sent it to public safety or sent it to the National Security Advisor, would they then be obligated to tell someone like Michael Chong about this? I mean, would that be your expectation, that if the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister received this information, they'd reach out to the MP or at least flag it with the PM?
Well, I don't think there's any legal obligation to begin there. So what we're talking about is a policy or a moral obligation. And again, I haven't read the assessment, so I don't know quite what it's formulated. But I think there's an obligation if anyone is threatened. It doesn't have to be an MP, and I think that's one of the dangers we're now facing. The Prime Minister, because he's dealing with this particular file, has issued an instruction to deal with threats against MPs. But that would be equally worrisome if the threat were against you or a member of the judiciary. So I don't really know there.
Do you think it's feasible, though? Because I guess this is a political question, that the opposition doesn't take the Prime Minister at his word that he didn't know, or certainly that senior political members of his government wouldn't know. Do you see a situation where it's feasible, this information, this sort of intelligence assessment, never makes it into the hands of an elected member of the government?
Well, let me put it to you this way. Since I haven't seen it, it's hard to comment, directly. But if I were the director, and as I was at one point, and somebody produced for me a formal assessment that seemed credible to me, that a member of parliament, a senator, a minister, anybody was threatened, I would make sure that it was passed on to the appropriate agency. Now, depending upon the circumstances, that agency may vary. It may be the Mounties, it may be the Parliamentary Protective Service, it could be somebody else. But I think not making sure that somebody who is in charge of protection, as opposed to intelligence assessment, that is in charge of protection has a chance to see the stuff, talk about it, think about it, and then I think in most circumstances, telling the individual would be a mistake.
We've spoken a lot over the past couple of months since intelligence and foreign interference has become a significant issue. I mean, one of the big challenges, we just don't know so much of what we're actually talking about, right? Like you haven't seen this. Michael Chong just found out about this. I mean, what needs to happen now that this has become an issue to help the public and help parliamentarians kind of understand exactly what is happening here in terms of what this threat could mean and how it should be handled?
Well, I think it's a difficult question to answer because the matter has become so politicized, it's become an object of partisan tennis back and forth, that I'm not sure how it can be done outside of a public inquiry. You'll know that I support the idea of a public inquiry, and I certainly hope that Mr. Johnson recommends one. But this is becoming sufficiently worrisome over, as you say, not just days or weeks, but months, that I think most Canadians can legitimately claim to be confused. And their faith in all of these institutions, not what it used to be. So we need something, somewhere, somehow to look into this at a great level of detail outside of the shadow of partisan politics and issue a report, even acknowledging that such a report would never be able to reduce national security information. But I continue to believe that in most cases, not in all, you can take national security information, aggregate it up, so that it's not necessarily a security concern anymore, but it conveys the sense of what's happened and what's been reported, at least enough that recommendations make sense. At a minimum, I think we should try and do that.
Michael Chong said today that what's happened here either shows that there's a failure of the machines of government, the machinery of government, in that him and his family weren't told, or it's a failure of the political operations of government, but because the Prime Minister and his staff would have known but chose not to act on it. Do you see it as binary as that? I mean, how do you view what has potentially happened here?
I think, like most things, it's not binary. I think, like most things, it's more complex than it appears to be on the surface. I think if the threat was at all credible, particularly about someone's family, I mean, for those of us who are either in elected or appointed office, we made the decision to do that. Our families do not and have not. So I think the threshold there should be very low. So if it was not passed on at all, I worry about the threshold that CSIS has applied. If it was passed on to those departments that I mentioned, I worry again about whether or not they didn't take it seriously enough. Mm-hmm. And if it was passed on at some level to, political staff or ministers, I very much hope that because the individual concerned was not a member of the governing party, that didn't stop them from taking necessary steps. But again, I come back to what I said very earlier. We need somehow to establish what the threshold is before this kind of reporting is necessary. And until we have a threshold that everybody agrees to, I think we're going to continue having these problems. But I think Mr. Chong is right to be quite upset about this. I don't really care in the end who did what to whom. We have to avoid this happening in the future. I think that's the most important element involved right now.
Richard Fadden, former director of CSIS, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.